afternoon or good morning, I guess, depending on where you are. Welcome to the Veritas Automata Deep Dive. I'm Ben Savage, the CEO and founder of Veritas Automata, and I have Saurabh with me. And we're going to continue talking about AI or whatever chaos we happen to get up to today. So let's talk about some of the news that came out, because there have been a couple of new models released this week, in the last really 2 days.
Llama 4 came out, and then the new Gwen, and then the R2 reasoning model came out. So it has been a waterfall of new models every other week, right? So, but it's interesting to see how the reasoning is getting more and more center stage. The runtime computation, they call it, right, where they are reasoning it and not just input and output, but it's kind of changing directions and hitting different things and reasoning within the LLM. It's kind of getting more and more interesting.
Well, and we were talking about, I think it's Qwen 3 that does it. It's similar to what Cogito does, the LG model, where now you can have the same model either give you thinking responses or just normal responses.
Right.
Which is interesting. So now you don't have to run multiple models necessarily.
Correct. I think having this MOE kind of inspiration into this setup, right, wherein you can switch between experts rather than now you're switching between reasoning model and more of a generative model. That architecture, I think, flows into. I think it's going to be more interesting. When you need speed, you go for generative. When you need more reasoning and thought process involved, you use the reasoning piece of it. It's going to get. I think that was the natural evolution of this whole trend, right? So
we'll come back to the news. I'm going to throw a question just based on what you're talking about, because you brought up the whole mixture of experts concept, which I always think is really interesting. And you and I have talked about for a long time, probably going back to that one conference we were at, 2018, 2017.
It was before the LLM was mainstream.
Whether it's a mixture of experts or you've got almost
a committee
type review, a committee type approach. But when you think about this from a business perspective, you're going to have different users with different knowledge bases. So I'm going to have marketing, I'm going to have sales, I'm going to have finance, I'm going to have operations, all of whom have different perspectives. So do you think that, and this is a conversation I was having with someone at lunch the other day, is do you train all of that into one model and then use system prompts to pull those out? Or do you actually say maybe they really should be separate models?
I would train them separately and then kind of bring them in by locking some of the weights down. And the reason is that you want to build real experts in certain domain and not have the others kind of get biased, right? It's again how you bring all of the answers from all of these experts, or are you routing between them, right? Or are you doing a committee setup where you have weighted votes from different, let's say it's a marketing, then sales and the marketing expert have highest weight versus, some other side of the business into it, right? So, it all depends on the business use case of it. A lot of the things we are seeing in the open world is right now very generic. But as soon as you start to get in a business use case, it needs to be more.
Well, and that's why they call them all foundational models, right? They're not, a lot of them are not intended necessarily to be used just purely as they are. They're intended for as a business that you're going to enrich, embed, add additional training, use some form of retrieval augmented generation to do something with it. But I think the other interesting point you bring up there is, like, if you think about it from that committee type approach or the mixture of experts, is it gives me different ways to partition the domain and the security of it. Because maybe engineering shouldn't be asking sales what the optimum price is, because they may not have enough domain knowledge to effectively do that. And if I have them as separate experts, I can really control that. Whereas if it's all the same model, it's a lot harder to prevent someone being able to jailbreak a response out of it.
Correct. I think that's very true, right? So, if you think about the jailbreaking stuff or the OpenAI thing that happened, they had to roll back. How did that?
Well, that was a little different. We can continue on that after this. I mean, that's different than the jailbreak. I'm thinking about, like, I have a business user for either curiosity or bad intent. Is trying to get the model to tell it something it shouldn't. If the model doesn't know about it, it can't tell you.
Correct. I mean, it can cook up stuff if it's hallucinating. So that's the other side of it, because often you take a foundational model and fine tuning and distill it, right? So it still inherently retains some of the public information out there for language training purposes and whatnot, right? So it might hallucinate it, but so that risk still resides on it. It's it's not completely gone away. So
but let's go back kind of in related news, because continuing on that news theme, you had mentioned about OpenAI, and they did have some issues with the way the model was responding. It was, a number of the press articles were saying it was overly sycophantic.
Yeah, I mean, it always is trying. I don't know how that originated. It could be due to it's taking in feedback in real time from lots of user and people who are giving feedback because they have the human, reinforcement learning loop in there. It just happened that the sample size they took to train the next version, they like that kind of responses, more chatty, more interactive, more engaging, and maybe that bias that whole thing. But a large portion of the population who doesn't give a feedback or they are not being asked for a feedback, they that influence didn't get in.
Yeah, well, that's always a challenge when you're asking for feedback, right?
Yeah.
How do you understand what percentage of your users are actually giving that feedback in those scenarios?
Correct.
And then is it valid feedback or, and we see this in non-AI and LLM tools, right? Where people were gaming Reddit or other social media platforms to try and make something algorithmically show up because they want to mess with people for whatever reason.
Right. I mean, beyond that, this could be also influence of the system prompt that they put in, the tone changes and all of that stuff. And ultimately, we're discussing, if you think about TikTok or Instagram, the motivation behind the system is to keep on scrolling. For LLM, more token consumption, which is you need to keep the conversation going so that they can burn more tokens and get you hooked onto it, and so.
Well, and I think it highlights some of the stuff to think about, right? There've been a couple articles from OpenAI themselves saying, hey, you don't need to be as polite to the models.
Exactly.
Don't burn as many wasted tokens.
Right.
Because this is what we're trying to monetize.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I kind of like the analogy that came up when we were talking. In some ways, it's kind of like a 1-900 number. The more you talk to it, the more revenue they can generate.
That's true. So, there's an incentive behind a lot of these things, right? So, I'll go back to the point where you mentioned, don't use being polite and, thank you and all of that stuff. Maybe there's a play to get feedback based on how the user is reacting. If you solved a problem and they reply by say thank you instead of asking exclusively is this better or the other, you use that as a feedback loop to train that stuff, right? So so it's kind of embedded, and then you are getting feedback from a much broader section of the society, right? Whenever ChatGPT prompts me, give the response, I don't have time to read through 2 big paragraphs of answers, right? So I just click one, and that's causing a lot of these issues that you're seeing for sure. So
well, and I think there's a whole other thing too. Is one, people forget how these are very broad at their core models,
right.
Whether it's open source foundational model or OpenAI,
right.
And so people are using these models for all kinds of things,
right.
Whether they're using it to talk to them as a sounding board or as a therapist or as an artificial friend, and that I think drives how it responds too, because the people who are going to use that are going to get very different responses than like you and I were talking. If we give it a business question, or a technical question, it doesn't have a reason to be sycophantic to us because we're not asking it what it thinks of our thought. We're just saying, help us determine this.
Kind of think through all of that stuff, right? So I think as the models more and more evolve, it will get better over the time. But again, is human reinforcement learning, it did wonders due to the last generation of models, but again, you're seeing issues from sampling it wrong, right, or having it collected from the wild world, kind of having issues also right there.
And I think that article did bring some people thinking about too, is are there some intentional or unintentional dark patterns in some of these? And you think that's something I think people haven't talked a lot about, which is, are people engineering these models to unintentionally create behaviors that are going to make people more likely to use them or potentially influence people in other ways? You think about like the dark patterns on the web, right? Where you, instead of having no as red, you put yes as red. So people are more likely to click that when they want to opt out, right? That's a really simple example. But do you create some of those kind of patterns intentionally or unintentionally, which that gets to be a little dystopian?
But, we touched about it in our last, episode where we talked about coding, right? Where people are leaving stuff inside, like misspelling, but having a bad library out there that is pulling from, right? Maybe it has already started because, you can see the internet with those kind of information and pattern where all of the LLMs are hungry for data. So they are gathering whatever they can, right? Hoovering it up. And
well, you don't even have to seed the LLM to do that. If you know that, and I did see a couple articles kind of continuing that theme about the package, creating the fake packages that are malicious, that some of the models are consistent in the ones that they generate. If they're consistent, someone can very easily go throw a package like that up into NPM or pip or something like that for Python.
Yeah.
All of a sudden people don't know. And
Yeah.
that's not, that attack itself as a supply chain software attack is not new. People do that today.
Yeah, that's true.
Not even waiting for the LLMs to do it. They know what people mistype, or they put something that looks like it.
Right. I mean, that problem would always be there. Is it's getting clean data is very, very expensive. It's all sanitized and all of that. So you're getting to a place where the LLMs would get very, very expensive, and that's where the enterprise LLM comes in, where it's trained on your own clean data and it doesn't have to touch the web, right? And even if you are training an LLM on your own code base, then it knows the libraries you are using and that doesn't go up. But the question arises, what if a new problem arises that you are trying to solve? How would you solve that if it's restricted to just your code base, right? So I think you brought up last time an interesting point is that as the LLM is thinking through the problem, use a RAG type thing to augment the prompt itself. So not a question and answer, but to pull references from your own code base or to answer another question.
And I think that's still kind of what I'm looking for in that, because, and I think that's why I think they're very good right now at working with like a function or a limited subset. But when you need to have the bigger architecture, right, that's hard for a person to go do.
Yeah.
I did see a tool. I forgot to send it to you, actually. I'll go dig it up again. But it was actually a tool that was really intended to go create documentation from someone's code base, and from fairly large code bases, it looked like.
Yeah.
And I saw an interesting write-up. But to me, that's a really interesting use case, because that's kind of the gateway to, if you've got your code base in something like that can generate documentation, it should understand the relationships between all your different functions and packages and elements, modules of your code.
Yeah.
So that way, now when you're starting to do the rest of it, it can know that this function, impacts like 10 other subsets of the application.
Yeah, I think documentation generation from the base code, or laying out the pseudocode in itself, could be a good application to make the code development more optimal for traditional industries as well. So
well, I think architecture doesn't go away. No matter how much AI is going to go work, you're still going to need someone to work and create a final architecture. And then they do that with AI assistants, but they're going to need someone to look at it and make sure, okay, do all these logical pieces tie together? How should it work? So then when it's starting to build some of it, this is kind of continuing that conversation from last week. Some of the more senior skills are still going to be super, super important.
Right. Yeah.
To be able to go do that right, because otherwise you're going to end up with something that it's the digital equivalent of a platypus.
Yep.
What is it I got here? I don't exactly know.
Yeah, I think it kind of more I look at the vibe coding and code generated by AI, I mean, a lot of the enterprises are jumping into it. I think there was a letter from JP Morgan Chase. They realized that, a lot of the companies are going into AI generated code and implementing AI without thinking about security first. And because a lot of these probabilistic model, it's not repeatable in most cases, right? And how does that stand in terms of the security, overall? You are getting to the market faster, you're solving the problem faster, but is it laying backdoors and vulnerabilities in the code base which could outweigh the benefits you got from getting there faster, right? So that was an interesting read.
I think it's that, but it's also when you're doing something algorithmic. So I'm building a forecasting algorithm for something.
Right.
How do I know exactly what that forecasting algorithm is doing? This is one of the problems sometimes even with conventional machine learning, where it's picking up on things that people don't realize. And LLMs now add it's probabilistically picking up on things that you don't notice. And that's what I always find fascinating when you look at some of these algorithms and people really dive into them. They think it's picking up on, like, I'll use some of the facial recognition one, right? They think it's focusing on the key areas of like the mouth and the eyes, but sometimes it's not focusing on that. And that's why you get unpredictable results when people make little changes, like very subtle changes with makeup can completely throw some facial recognition models out because they're not looking at the whole face.
I think the AI has certainly made things easy to get from an idea to a product, but it also introduces, is it a house built of straws kind of? Did you do the foundational work better? Would it stand the first hurricane that comes through, or the first rainfall that happens? Would it stand? Because you could have got to market and have thousands of users subscribe to it, and then an attack happens or something goes down, then you have 1,000 grumpy customers who are never going to come back, right?
Well,
So
and sometimes that's just where having an experienced team do the development is important, because AI may not know, like the system goes down. Let's take the grid in Spain.
Yes.
Power grid goes down.
Yeah.
You can't just turn everything back on. You've got to have a very regimented process to bring up each piece.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's going to start to come down. It's going to fail again because you drop too much load on it.
Right.
Like for the IoT solutions that we've built, we call that the thundering herd.
Yeah.
The network goes offline for a period of time, and all 1,000 or 10,000 devices come home, and the servers go, "Oh hell no!" and they go shut down again.
That's right.
So you got to think about, how do you build tools or methods to go cope with that?
Right.
And a lot of those patterns are not going to be documented on the data this is trained in, because not everyone has those.
Correct. So the litmus test of how you measure an IT project is probably gonna change from speed to more on, hey, how resilient it is, how safe it is, how has it been engineered, right? So rather than looking at the walls of the building, looking at the foundational stuff, measuring that aspect of it would become more and more important.
How is it tested? How do you
Exactly.
verify that testing?
Yeah, even the testing piece of it is automated. A lot of the test cases are automated. What's happening when you generate the code, you describe the requirements and also provide a test cases, right? If the LLMs are really good at optimizing things, so it can build something just that works on your test cases, but nothing beyond that, right? Not a generic use cases. So having the rigor to kind of look through the logic pieces, step through it, and do the smell test, not using another code, but and a senior level person who has seen that and done that kind of look at it, right? So the role of the developers are becoming more of herd leaders, kind of, rather than,
I think it deepens the need for their expertise in a
Right.
lot of ways, right?
Yeah.
Because they have to know not only how to lead the herd, but they have to understand how to identify some of those more systematic issues, or when things go wrong.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. And that's what I keep coming back to, because when a system goes wrong, particularly a large system, it's like, okay, is it in the application? Is it in the data? Is it in the network? Is it in the infrastructure? Where do I start to go find these? And then once I find it, okay, we had a team that was doing some work, and they had to go, not just in the application that we'd built, they had to go into a tool that we were using and into an OS level library that tool was using to go find where there happened to be a bug. And that only happened with someone who knew how to go through and just continue segmenting and working through it.
Right. I think programmers are going to turn into more and more of the old school hacker kind of thing, where they were putting things together and trying to figure out how it really works, right? If you go back to 1980s and 90s, we would have to assemble our own computer, right? My kids, they did just like iPad. They have never assembled a computer until forced to do it. But, that's the thing.
So you're saying they get off easy because they don't have to figure out how to configure like IRQs and ISA buses and all that stuff like we did in DOS.
Yeah, I mean, even this thing that your computer is not booting because your battery is dead, they have no clue that that thing exists, or your RAM is loose, or things like that. I feel bad about them, but they are using it more than I did in 1990s and 80s, right? But if it breaks down, they go run to dad to fix it, right? And versus me at that age, I was trying to figure out how to make this work, right?
No, it's a good point. The reason I was IRQs, I've burned in my memory a system that I was working on.
Yeah.
And I think I was trying to optimize it to run Doom.
Right.
So it also dates when I was doing this, but it was an old DOS computers before Windows.
Yeah.
And it was a 486SX, so no math coprocessor.
Okay.
And I was trying to get the modem configured.
Okay.
Somehow I mixed up the IRQ for the modem and the hard drive. And now a computer is not going to let you try and dial out on your hard drive. That system, when I set the IRQ and I ran the software, it was probably CompuServe to go connect, or AOL or whatever it was, Prodigy, one of those. It starts trying to dial out on the hard drive. And so you hear like the pulse tones of like an old school phone. So not even tone, but like the pulse. You hear it. Yeah, that hard drive was never the same after that. Always check your configurations.
Yeah. I mean, if you today's world, the parallel would be setting up your own GPU server versus renting something. There's a lot that goes on managing those GPU cards, thermal management, and beyond that, if you want to set up a VM, GPU pass through some of these stuff, right? If you just go back.
You're just scarred because I was trying to get you to set up some of the video models and they didn't like two video cards.
Well, I have GPUs which have caught fire. So
But was that your configuration, or was that some of those power supply and power connector issues?
It's a mix of both. So it's somewhere in the middle, a loose connector, because if you look at today's GPU card, they need massive amounts of pins, and one of them is loose where you're running it at 100% capacity, trying to tune it. Yeah, something tends to melt.
I did see, maybe it was Asus or somebody now has in their newest cards, in their 5090s and their high-end ones, they've got a accelerometer and a IMU. So they know if the card is sagging because you don't have it properly supported, because of, I think, some of those issues you're talking about.
Yeah, these cards are massively heavy and they're held on by little pins, and if you didn't tighten the bolts in the back. Again, going back to the whole thing that, my kids wouldn't be able to do it because they're not interested, because it's so easy for them. Why would they go through that hardware placement? And I think the coding has changed in a similar way today because of LLMs and stuff like that. They would like, okay, I'm going to write up this and try it out without thinking, if it goes wrong, how can I fix it? Right? They would go back to the LLM. That's my example, is that if I have an issue with an LLM, I will feed it back to the LLM and keeps looping, and it makes a nice big Rube Goldberg machine to solve a little if then else problem, right? So it goes through a massive plot because it's trying to debug to a smaller and smaller context. And
and then it loses context part.
Yes,
Back, we didn't talk about this when we were talking about the vibe coding last week, but like when I was working through some of those, I would get 3/4 of the way through, and then I ask it a question. Then at some point, it's forgotten all the initial prompts I've asked.
Right.
And now it's like, but you have all that data. How did you forget what I just asked you?
Yeah, it's a mix of context window and the attention network, because attention is how you train the attention network, right? Where it is paying attention, kind of basically what it boils down to. If you're trying to debug something, it's only paying attention to smaller front, but not the entire context, because it's, again, the computation optimizations and all of that stuff comes into the picture, right? So yeah, I think it's the code generation using AI. It's very exciting, but for enterprise adoption and all of this stuff, I still feel there's a need for experts in the mix, looking at their pipeline, setting up all of the security checks, right?
Because I think there will. So I'm going to shift topics.
Yeah,
We've been talking about vibe coding for a lot of this one and last time.
Yeah.
But what we haven't talked about is using AI and LLMs for data analysis. And you and I were talking a little bit about that earlier today. About, okay, so I have a gigabyte data set, which is not super big, but it's not something I'm going to run through Excel either.
Correct.
So there are tools I can use like Power BI or Superset or something like that.
Right.
But what do you think about using AI to go through it? Because I know you were going through some of those newer libraries that were more conventional ML, I think, too.
Yeah. So typically, as a data scientist, what I would attack the problem is, kind of define what are we trying to do, and then feed a snippet of the data, which is basically what are the column, what are the data types, and some examples from the data, and also feed in some of the missing percentage, some basic stats about the data. And then you can ask the question to LLM, hey, how can we solve this kind of basis, right? It will generate a code. If your data is clean, it will run. If it doesn't, then you have to go through all of the kinks to figure this out. But I think you mentioned about how good it is writing SQL statements and things like that, right? So it is fairly good if you explain the data structure to them, how they are connected, joined. So if you think about it, if you are joining 5 different tables, each table has a lot of columns, your prompt is becoming bigger and bigger. So, local models struggle versus more of a public model. They are much better. So, the path is same, but if you would want to solve this on a local, you would kind of narrow it down to the joining columns and your key columns, and then just feed that data structure, and maybe it will be able to do it.
So, and this is the same question I would ask with vibe coding. At what point is it just easier to write the code than that you're writing the prompt that is so long, you could just write the code faster?
Let me tell you. So my son doesn't know how to turn off his phone using the button sequence. He pulls up Siri and say, turn off the phone. Right?
I didn't know you could ask Siri to do that.
I didn't know that either, but yesterday he did
I was going to settings.
So anyway, that tells you, right? It's human brains are also optimizing against results and how much energy we are spending as to get to that answer, right? So they typically would gravitate towards somebody who is more familiar with vibe coding rather than kind of going through all of that stuff towards that as a first answer to it. But because that's the easiest to get a solution out of there, right? So So it will still exist, but the problem that I'm seeing more and more is that how do you debug a vibe coded generated, right? That kind of takes you going through the steps to understand it and do it. So,
well, you've got to do that, and you've got to hope that however vibe coded built enough logging in.
Yeah.
And then someone's going to be on experience. Like I think I told you, I still haven't gone back and fixed it yet. But the app I vibe coded that I talked with you in Crichton about, I'm fairly sure the issue is it's using an x86 library on an ARM-based machine, which is why I'm getting like a floating point 16 error or something like that.
Right.
But you've got to have enough experience to know that. I don't even know if an LLM model is going to immediately say, "Hey, this is a CPU architecture issue."
Yeah. I mean, if you think about this, like there's so much medical information out on the web, you could self-diagnose it, but there's still doctors around and specialists around. So this probably is going towards that, where you had no option but to go to a doctor for even nosebleed or something like that. Now you have a way to look it up and mitigate that.
So what's the term going to be for a computer user who identifies a problem? For people, you've got hypochondriacs, or there's a different term, I think, where they go and identify something in WebMD, and it's maybe a little bit of the symptoms, but it's not really what they have. So what is the computer user equivalent going to be for that?
Dangerous people, I would say. It's like having a 3D printer, right? You can print whatever you want, but they don't stand the test of time. So the other day I 3D printed a electrical switch, steampunk looking thing, right? Now it's on verge of breaking because it couldn't withstand the turns on and off.
That's one, that's the materials you choose, and two, it's how you print it, right? Because if you print the build layers so that it's going in the direction you're applying force versus the...
See, I didn't have that knowledge. I just got a 3D printer, it prints beautiful stuff. That's what's happening with vibe coding. You got an access to some tool that can generate something real quick and fancy, and you think now you have a commercial grade switch. Now, that's where I'm going at with the vibe coding. It made manufacturing easy, like a 3D printer, but you need to know about material science, you need to know about design to build something.
Well, but that's actually probably a really good example, because 3D printing will let you do things that you can't manufacture in some other ways. And it's really good for small batches.
Right.
But there's a certain point where I need to create something I'm going to make millions of.
Right.
And create that level of scalability. I still have to go make an injection mold.
Right.
I'm probably still going to have to machine that. Now, I may use some AI tools to help with the machining and planning all that routing out and all that. But I can't 3D print it, because there's a certain point where the time it takes to do the 3D printing and the cost becomes a non-trade-off, or other structural issues.
I mean, maybe the drawing on the same inspiration for enterprise grade, the 3D printing would be an expensive EDM kind of a machine, right, which builds metals and other exotic material, whereas the home ones are like the ones PLA and all of that stuff, right? So maybe down the fork, the LLM would fork out that one is for consumer grade, maybe enthusiast grade, and then you have the commercial grade, which is kind of really hardened solution that can build solutions that.
Or you end up with the open source, and those who know how to use it properly can build something enterprise grade, and everything else is kind of what a lot of open source is, where you look at it and go, it's really complex, and I can kind of make it work, and then it does something weird, and I'm scratching my head because there's no manual. And don't take that as a knock on open source. I love open source, but I'm permanently scarred from the first time I set up an Asterisk PBX. Once I got it set up, it was rock solid, but to get it running, oof. That's back to configuring cards. I had to configure a T1 card on like a ISA or bus or something at that point.
So the question, how did we end up from vibe coding to 3D printing? And is there a path between them to merge together?
Well, there is some stuff. We were talking about Quen earlier, and I know there's a couple others, but like Quen has some 3D some text to 3D shape models, and those will do 3D solids, and those then you can go import into a 3D printer. So there is a path. Now, I think some of that you've got to be a little careful. You may have to do some cleanup, and because it's giving you just a solid. Because when you think about 3D printing, right, you can have either CAD, where I've got all the individual components and stuff, or I've got a solid, which is just a single shape. It can be much harder to clean up some of those shapes to make them really work. But there's a path. That's actually what I was thinking about. I think it was, what was it? The last week or so, there's been, or 2 weeks, there's been a bunch of people using different AI tools to create action figures from their pictures. I'm like, you could probably 3D print those.
I've seen those on LinkedIn where they are like, those are pretty cool. But so that's where I think the world is heading to. Right now, it's just a one solution, but it's going to fork very quickly into multiple down the line.
But I think your question was the right one. And it kind of typifies how you and I think about things and how our whole team thinks about things, which is we're looking at how things are connected. And we're always very curious to say, okay, if we go down this path, what happens?
Yeah.
So some point, I guess we do have 3D printers, and we may have to go test that one.
Sure.
So,
you have commercial grade ones too.
yeah.
So that's pretty cool.
Cool. Well, we appreciate everyone joining us. Today will be a little bit of a short one, and we'll catch you in another 2 weeks. So we thank everyone for joining us.